What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a speed test comparison between three of Samsung's A series phones, the A24, A34, and A54. The reason I like doing these sorts of tests is because I think it's valuable to fully understand the real difference in the performance and the user experience, and go beyond just listing out the specs. Most importantly, I think a real-world side-by-side comparison like this can also help determine if spending maybe $50 or $100 more for one device over another is really worth it. Samsung's A-series devices are super close in price and overall features, so hopefully this paints a clearer picture as to what you really get from each one. Now, if you aren't already familiar, these three phones are the upper half of Samsung's A-series lineup this year. There's a few different A04s and A14s, but the A24 is right smack in the middle. It retails right now for about $185, but the important thing to mention with this one is it's not a 5G capable phone. The A34 obviously is the next step up, and for $60 or $70 more, I do think you wind up with a substantially better device, which you'll see in a moment. The top-end A-series phone this year is the A54. It's considerably more expensive, but seemingly on a perpetual limited time deal, $349 for this one. Like I do with all my speed tests, all three phones have been set up the exact same way, with the same apps installed and nothing preloaded. Surprisingly, they're all running the same version of Android and One UI with the same June 1st Google Play system update, so everything is about as even as can be. And as far as the Geekbench scores and the specs, well, this should give you the first clue as to what we're about to see. So the A24 is considerably less powerful than the other two phones. Inside, it has the MediaTek Helio G99 processor and Mali G57 GPU, and the option of either 4, 6, or 8 gigabytes of RAM, though mine has 4 gigs, and I think most folks who buy this phone will be stuck with 4 gigabytes as well. The A34 gets the MediaTek Dimensity 1080 and the Mali G68 GPU. My phone here has 6 gigabytes of RAM, though again, you could opt for an 8 gig version if it's available to you. The A54, well, it has Samsung's own Exynos 1380 processor and similar Mali G68 GPU, along with 6 gigs of RAM, though again, the option of opting for 8 gigs if it's available. And I already know some people are just eager to criticize Samsung's Exynos chipset in this phone. Now, to start off, with your regular default Android apps and Samsung stuff, I've found that the biggest performance difference here is of course between the A24 and the other two devices. The A24 just feels slow. It feels less responsive by comparison. And from the actual app launch animations to the page loads and scrolling, it's just kind of a clunkier experience. And actually, I wouldn't normally say that using something like the A24 by comparison is going to impact your day or slow your workflow down, but honestly, from time to time, it's a little extra slow. And taking 2 or 3 or 4 seconds to load a web page or refresh an app does start to add up. You won't experience that drastic of a difference all the time, of course, but it's often enough where I think jumping up to the A34 already makes a lot of sense. The real question is whether or not going from the A34 to the A54 is worth it, strictly from a performance point of view. The Geekbench scores weren't that decisive. The side-by-side test here with the easy stuff doesn't show much of an advantage or disadvantage either way, but I know some people just inherently have a negative opinion of Exynos chipsets anyway. And as we start to push these phones a little harder, what you'll likely see is what a lot of people criticize. The Exynos processor in the A54, while supposedly more powerful on paper, winds up getting tripped up more often than it should. One other thing I should also mention is that the fluidity of scrolling and the visual animations and touch responsiveness not only depend on those internal processors, but also on the displays themselves. The A24 has a 90 Hz display, the A34 has a set 120 Hz display, and the A54 has an adaptive 120 Hz display that changes its refresh rate based on a number of factors. So visually, with everything else being even, The A34 and A54 should look more fluid and smooth with their animations and feel more responsive with their touches, but everything else isn't even. The A24 also just has worse specs, so that's also why its animations and scrolling tend to be choppy. It's not just the refresh rate on the display, it's the overall performance of the phone. The other thing to keep in mind is that while you may not necessarily experience a performance difference at first, the more apps you load up, the more RAM you'll need to keep everything running, both smoothly in front of you and in the background when you jump back to an app. 4 GB of RAM on a smartphone nowadays, I don't think is enough. Even 6 GB for an Android device isn't a whole lot, regardless of the $300 or $400 price tag. But between these three phones, and between 4 GB of RAM and 6 GB of RAM specifically, I think you can see that the A24 just can't really keep up after about a dozen apps or so. 50% of the time, whatever you just looked at a few minutes ago will need to be completely reloaded. I think my big takeaways here for the first part of the speed tests are that the A24 by comparison performs, I think, quite a bit worse than its lower price point would suggest. I mean, for less than $100 more, the A34 is noticeably faster, more fluid, more responsive, and yes, proportionally at this price range, that's a lot of money, but I do think the A34 is 2 or 3 times as good, so the extra cost is pretty justified. What maybe isn't justified is jumping from the A34 to the A54, and this surprised me. Yeah, there are maybe other reasons to get the A54. It has a brighter display, better camera, but performance-wise, the difference is almost non-existent, which I find sort of odd. Now, when we test out some games, a few things happen here. For one, the difference in the A24 becomes even more obvious. Now you may be waiting an extra 5 or 6 or 7 seconds, not just from the launch screen of an app, but also when you actually jump into the gameplay. You also might notice a little more choppiness with the graphics-heavy games, at least when everything starts to load up. In-game performance isn't necessarily affected, but there's always that little bit of jitteriness right when you first load everything. The other thing I see is that the A34 and A54 kind of take turns back and forth with which one loads stuff first. Sometimes the A34 is decisively ahead, which again is just odd when you consider the fact that it should technically be the lesser phone. But I think this really just boils down to the fact that the stigma with Samsung's Exynos processors is still somewhat true. They don't seem to be maybe as efficient or as powerful as they should be. And they aren't decisively better than a similarly spec'd MediaTek or Snapdragon chipset. I don't think the A54 has any glaring performance issues, but I don't think performance alone justifies the extra bump up in price. And that's kind of a shame because it's difficult to explain why the A54 may not be the clear winner with speed and performance when it is in fact the higher end A series phone. But it's more clear when you can see it side by side. And then it becomes sort of hard to justify the extra dollars. Obviously, all this depends on your own personal smartphone usage. There are certainly plenty of people who will find the A24 to be perfect for their daily needs. And for well under $200 now, it's a perfectly decent phone. If performance is most important to you, and you have that little extra to spend, the dollar per performance ratio going to the A34 is very much justified. But I've sort of realized with this test here that maybe going all the way to the A54 isn't totally necessary. And I'm sort of disappointed to see that this phone isn't an obvious choice performance-wise. But what do you guys think? Are you surprised by these results? Did it change your opinion on which phone you'd buy? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though, or at least found it somewhat helpful. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.